early groups of guys. The Lumiere brothers in France, Thomas Edison and his group, the Black Maria Studios in New Jersey, and they were developing films. Now, as you watch those films, and if you haven't, please go back and watch it. There's only a couple minutes on each one. Ask yourself, is there a difference in the way these movies were captured or the subjects that they were shooting? I think if you observe a little closer, there is. It tends to be that with Edison's films, they usually are in a more controlled environment on a stage or on a set, or maybe in some sort of, I think, the boxing ring or the cockfights. You know, it's just a couple of people creating something within an environment for people to watch. Pardon me. And the Lumiere brothers tend to have a little bit more of a documentary feel, in that they're going out and capturing people leaving a factory, or in some scenes just going out into a street and seeing cars drive by or buggies go by or a train come towards them. There's a couple that aren't on the clip that I put on there that I like to show in class, of people just out at the beach, swimming in the ocean or collecting clams on the beach. And of course they're all dressed in a very Victorian era garb at the beach. My, how things have changed. But nonetheless, the Lumiere brothers had a little bit more of a documentary or a capturing life vibe, and Edison's films seem to be a little bit more kind of controlled, more like a studio type of film. And I bring this up because really early on, cinema is going to develop quickly in capturing life, like Lumiere and Edison's, and in the two different ways you could do it. You could stage it, or you could actually go out and capture it. And then, as we're going to come to our next films here, The Trip to the Moon and The Great Train Robbery, both of these guys are going to develop it as an art form of telling stories. Now, A Trip to the Moon. This is made by another French gentleman, Georges Méliès. He got his camera from the Lumiere brothers, and he quickly learned that you can manipulate time. Like I said, both Edison and Lumiere, even though they were capturing a little different types of life at that time, Georges Méliès, both of them would capture real-time people, or real-time dancers, or real-time street scenes, and there was no comprehension of manipulating that. So Georges Méliès, thanks to an accident when his camera jammed, and actually a car was moving down the street, and then all of a sudden it disappeared, got this idea like, wow, you can manipulate time. It doesn't have to follow the laws of empirical reality. Let's rephrase that. You can manipulate time. You don't have to follow the laws of empirical reality, meaning that it doesn't have to flow from A to B as it does in life. We could actually make a couple changes or a couple edits and move things along quicker. So his early films were narrative in nature, but they definitely strive to manipulate what we're not. They definitely strive to manipulate our mind and our imaginations. So watch A Trip to the Moon. You'll see a lot of in-camera special effects, people disappearing, smoke popping up as they attack the aliens. You're going to see some stop motion, overlapping dissolves. We're all used to these things. You know, when we go to a movie, one scene dissolves to the next scene, or when something fades to black, we're used to that. But these are the guys that developed what we're used to. This is part of that language that I was talking about. So fade in and fade out, dissolve, and even stop motion. Well, Méliès was one of the first pioneers to develop this art form and to develop this way of making movies. So A Trip to the Moon was made in 1902, and I encourage you to watch it and to enjoy it. It is a little hard to watch being a 21st century viewer. It is more or less presented as a play that the camera happens to be capturing, though there are some really kind of cool special effects for its time. There are no close-ups. There's no kind of speeding up the story quickly. It kind of plays out over 10 minutes for you. But nonetheless, it is a fantasy. It's a science fiction type of a movie. It has elaborate sets, fantastic costumes, and I think a lot of imagination for the fact that it was made, 106 years ago? That's amazing. So, anyways, go take if you haven't done so, go take a look at A Trip to the Moon. Alright, our next one, and this will be moving into our last phase of this lecture. Our next one is The Great Train Robbery, and that was created by Edwin Porter. And I really think in some ways this was a little bit more sophisticated narrative. It tells kind of more of a real-life story. Now, you might think, a train robbery, real-life story? Well, think of the era. I mean, we're talking about 1903. It wasn't but a decade or two ago that the Wild West was still going on, that stories of train robberies and Jesse James and the Great Gold Rush in California were all still fresh in people's minds. And if you're out west in 1903, there still is a lot of this kind of going on. So it's based on reality that could happen, as opposed to Malaise kind of dealing with a fantasy story of going to the moon. Interesting thing about Porter is that this movie, The Great Train Robbery, was a huge success, though he didn't really make a lot of money off of it because they were still working out the whole copyright laws back then. And so people copied it and would show it in the theater and make money off it. And poor Mr. Porter didn't necessarily get all the money from the screening of those movies. In the movie,